Washington Carver. My name is David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars. This is part of our American Innovation webinar series, George Washington Carver and Agricultural Innovation. Now, I'd like to say first what the prompt is for our participants, then introduce our participants, and then briefly say how we're doing this. So, guiding questions for the participants. George Washington Carver had a genius for agriculture, a genius that allowed him to challenge prevailing norms and take a fresh look at topics that others considered settled. From peanut butter to soil rotation techniques, modern agriculture owes much to Carver's work. What are his contributions to modern agricultural science? What challenges did he face and how did he overcome them? Now, our three distinguished panelists are, in alphabetical order, Mr. William Federer, who is Senior Fellow at the D. James Kennedy Center for Christian Statesmanship, President of Amerisearch, Inc., and a nationally known speaker and best-selling author of more than 20 books. Dr. Mark Hersey is Associate Professor of History at Mississippi State University and author of, among other things, My Work is That of Conservation, an environmental biography of George Washington Carver. Dr. Gary Kremer is the Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri and also an adjunct professor of history at the University of Missouri. He has written a large number of books as well, including George Washington Carver in his own words and George Washington Carver, a biography. All of them have many more distinguished publications, which ought to be appearing in the chat and Q&A buttons down below, or chat or Q&A buttons down below, and not too long. Now, that's going to lead me to my next topic. Our speakers speak for 12 to 14 minutes each. It's then the Q&A part of the session, moderated by yours truly. Please put your questions ideally into chat, perhaps also into Q&A. I can then recite your questions out loud for posterity, and or they can be answered directly by our participants, who also have the opportunity to speak directly to one another. If your questions are not answered by the end of the session, and I skip around, in whatever order for the questions, just for whatever seems interesting to make a good conversation, send email to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'll be delighted to forward your questions to our participants so that they can have the opportunity to respond to you directly. Also, don't worry if you have to leave halfway through. This is being recorded and will appear on our National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours for perpetuity. So, always will have a chance to watch this. Now we're going to go in alphabetical order. William Federer, may I ask if you'd be so kind as to go first?
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be with you, as well as with Mark Hershey and Gary Kremer. And my first introduction to George Washington Carver is my mom is from Neosho, Missouri. And I grew up visiting all of the Carver places, walked along the different streets, and so sort of had a personal connection. And my grandparents gave me a book on George Washington Carver, like many of individuals. And I was so touched. And so years later, after I wrote my small little book, I gave a copy to Missouri State Senator John Loudon. He gave a copy to all the state legislators, and they actually passed the bill to add the sign along the Highway 44, making that little stretch of highway the George Washington Carver Memorial Highway. So a little contribution there to his heritage. On Carver, he was raised by the German immigrant couple, the Carvers. He called Uncle Mose and Aunt Susan. And they did not attend church, but they lived close by to a Locust Grove church. And that's where traveling Methodist, Baptist, and Disciples of Christ and Presbyterian circuit riding preachers would stop. Carver tells the story of how he met one day a little white boy, and he said he was going to Sunday school the next day. And he said, I asked him what Sunday school was. He said they sang hymns and prayed. I asked him what prayer was. He says, I don't remember what he told me. I just remember that after he left, I went into the loft of the barn, prayed as best I could. I don't remember what I said. I just remember I felt so good. I did it several times before I quit. I just thought that was so innocent. Well, then he goes into Neosho. He's around 8 years old, walks the road that I've traveled down many times. And he was taken in by a childless Black couple who he called Aunt Mariah and Uncle Andy Watkins. And they introduced him to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and they gave him his first Bible. And I sort of traced the faith of Carver and how it intersects in his life. In July of 1883, George was admitted to the Presbyterian Church when he was living in Kansas. And then he eventually migrates to Winterset, Iowa, and he is working a job at the St. Nicholas Hotel. And in the evening, he would attend Presbyterian, Baptist, and Methodist churches. And that is where he met John and Helen Milholland and in 1890. And they encouraged him to continue his education, pursuing art, music at Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa. And he tells the story, and it's quite fascinating. So in 1922, in response to Mrs. Helen Milholland's request, he wrote a brief sketch of my life. And in there, he said, while living in Iowa, he said, one evening I went to a white church and sat in the rear of the house. The next day, a handsome man called for me at the hotel where he was working and said his wife wanted to see me. When I reached the splendid residence, I was he noticed that she was the person that was in the choir. I was astonished to recognize her as the lady in the choir. I was most astonished when she told me that my fine voice had attracted her. I had to sing quite a number of pieces for her and agreed to come to their house at least once a week. And from that time till now, Mr. and Mrs. Milholland have been my warmest and most helpful friends. And so they encouraged him to pursue his education at Simpson College. And that is when he then transferred to Iowa State. And he writes in May 5th of 1922 to Dr. Lewis H. Hamill. He said, Wilson, the Honorable James Wilson, that name is sacred to me. He was one of the finest teachers it has been my privilege to listen to. He taught a Sunday school class in which every student would have enrolled if they had been allowed. The class grew so large that he conceived of a very unique plan to divide it. So he graduated some 20 or 25 of us who had been with him the longest. I happened to be one of those who graduated. We all left him sad and reluctantly and gave him to understand that in no uncertain terms, we did not like it at all, but out of love for him, we went. But in less than 2 months, we were all back again. Our displeasure grieved him very much that he said to me many times that he would never try to divide the class again, no matter how large it got. And so then he writes letters. His correspondence is quite fascinating. He wrote again to Mrs. Milholland, September 17th, 1922. He says, how glad I was to get your good letter. It seemed so refreshing to hear from you. No, the book does not even appear to approach yours. Somebody else had written a book on it. And I believe God in some way will provide a way for yours to come out. I am anxious for you to see this little book because it is put into the schools for information of the white boys and girls down here who seem to know so little about many types of colored people. And then he writes to a James Hardwick, May 21st, 1924. He says, my friend, God has indeed been good to me and is yet opening up wonders and allowing me to peep in, as it were. I do love the things God has created, both animate and inanimate, as he speaks aloud through both. God willing, at Blue Ridge, we will let him talk to some of us. And that was where a YMCA was that he spoke. He says, I am just trying through Christ to be a better man each day. And the one letter that everyone's familiar with is when he got the letter from Booker T. Washington inviting him to Tuskegee. And he writes back. He says, my dear sir, writing to Booker T, I am just in reply of yours, the 13th instant, hasten to reply. I'm looking forward to a very busy, pleasant, and profitable time at your college. I'll be glad to cooperate with you in doing all I can through Christ who strengtheneth me to better the condition of our people. And then the different statements he made, November 19th, 1924. He spoke to 500 women at the Women's Board of Domestic Missions in New York's Marbled Collegiate Church, very historic church. And he says, God is going to reveal things to us he never revealed before if we put our hands in his. No books ever go into my laboratory. The thing I have to do, the way of doing it, are revealed to me. I never have to grope for methods. The method is revealed to me the moment I'm inspired to create something new. Without God to draw aside the curtain, I would be helpless. Well, the New York Times heard about that talk and wrote an editorial criticizing him, November 24th, 1924. And the title was Men of Science Never Talk That Way. And they tried to discredit him. And then he writes, he says, my dear sir, I've read with much interest your editorial pertaining to myself in the issue of November 20th. I regret exceedingly that such a gross misunderstanding should arise as to what was meant by divine inspiration. Inspiration is never at a variance with information. In fact, the more information one has, the greater the inspiration. Paul, the great scholar, said in 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show yourselves approved unto God. And yet again, he said in Galatians 1:12, for I neither received it from man, neither was taught it, but it was by revelation of Jesus Christ. Many, many other equally strong passages could be cited. And then he goes on to say all of his educational credentials and all of his professors. So he is somebody who's educated, but then he talks about going to the market in New York and seeing some roots that were imported from Puerto Rico, China, Dutch Guyana, Peru. And he says, just as soon as I saw these luscious roots, I marveled at the wonderful possibility for their expansion. Dozens of things came to me while standing there. He said I would follow the same or similar lines of experimentation that I did with the white potato. I know of no one who has ever worked with these roots in this way. I know of no book from which I can get the information. Yet I will have no trouble in doing it. If this is not inspiration from a source greater than myself, kindly tell me what it is. And then he gives the scripture, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And one of the stories that is popular is how he was writing about how actually he went before the Congress. It was a debate over whether or not they should have a tax on imported peanuts from China. And so January 21st, 1921, the United Peanut Growers Association asked him, he went to the U.S. House Ways and Means Committee. Fascinating story. They wouldn't let him in because he was dressed in a simple suit, put a new flower in the lapel every day. The doorman thought he was not fit to come in. But then they look for him, they find him, and of course, they say, you're late, you have only 15 minutes to talk. And then when he begins to talk, they're so fascinated that the head of the chairman says, go ahead, brother, your time is unlimited. He spoke for an hour and 45 minutes. And this is actually in the congressional record there. He says, if you go to the first chapter of Genesis, we can interpret very clearly, I think, what God intended when he said, behold, I've given you every herb that bears seed, to you it shall be meat. This is what he means about it. It shall be meat. There is everything there to strengthen and nourish and keep the body alive and healthy. And then after that, the chairman said, Dr. Carver, how did you learn such things? He said, from an old book. What book? The chairman replied. Carver said, the Bible. Does the Bible tell about peanuts? No, sir, Carver replied, but it tells about the God who made the peanut. I asked him to show me what to do with the peanut, and he did. And there's lots of more stories there, but it just gives a little bit of a insight into the spiritual aspect of his life that helped guide his life.
Thank you very much. Lovely hearing you. And now I'll go to the second person, Professor Hersey.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill, for that. And hold on. Trying to, oops, a baby. Mark this up. So I often ended my talks, Bill, I should say this, when people ask me questions, what did Carver think of himself? How did he think of himself? He would, the first answer I think he would have given would be Christian. I think that was at the heart of who he was. But by way of introduction to Carver's, the record of Carver's innovation, I wanted to talk a little bit about the public divide. And I think there's going to be a PowerPoint. Is that, do we have that, Kaylee? There we go. So you could hit the first button there. So So Carver, of course, in the public imagination is one of the most famous figures of any race. Famous as an inventor, as a scientist, maybe as a chemist in particular. But apart from associating him from peanuts, most Americans don't know too much about him. So he's got a USDA building named in his honor. There's a nuclear submarine carries his name. He appears in TV. He's referenced in TV shows like Saturday Night Live and Seinfeld. He appears in movies. Stevie Wonder wrote a song about him. And of course, there are myriad children's books. But there's a bit of a divide in how public or how professional historians have thought about him, as you can see from these headlines from, or these titles from the 1970s. Because I think the focus on Carver as a creative chemist distracted historians too. And they've basically ignored him, professional historians have, or for a long time they did. Beginning in the 1970s, when you can see the subtitle of Barry McIntosh's article, The Making of a Myth. They debunked his reputation as a scientist, claiming that most of the things for which he was famous, he didn't actually do. So he didn't invent peanut butter. He didn't save the South's economy. He wasn't responsible for agricultural diversification in the South. He didn't introduce soil rotation, crop rotation in the region. Whatever. Worse than that, because he wasn't politically outspoken about Jim Crow, he was portrayed, along with Booker T. Washington, actually at the time, as something of an Uncle Tom. Linda McMurray wrote a very good biography of him in 1981 that challenged that take. It was a much more sympathetic take on Carver. But as you can see from David Herbert Donald, and I should point out that Donald was a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, they basically, historians weren't persuaded. They ended with, he's no longer part of our usable past. And now I wasn't sure when I started this what exactly that meant. I'm not sure what usable past meant in that context. What isn't part of the usable past in some meaningful way. But in any case, Carver was sort of sidelined by them. So we have a very famous figure in the public imagination and a figure who didn't appear and still really doesn't appear in college level textbooks. You can go to the next slide. My work sought to rectify that to some degree by taking Carver seriously at his word. Looking back from the vantage point of the end of his life, Carver claimed that his life's work had been that of conservation. And so I thought maybe we should begin to think what he meant when he said that. So to do that, I began looking at Carver's agricultural thought and what was sort of innovative and new about it. And that story, you can be traced back further, but we're going to begin today, at least, at the Iowa Agricultural College, where Carver received a first-rate education, really maybe the best education that you could imagine in agricultural science at the time. The figures on your screen are all prominent people. On the right side at the bottom is Joseph L. Budd, who was a leading horticulturist, one of America's leading horticulturists at the time. The dour-looking fellow above him to the left is James Wilson, who was Secretary of Agriculture under 3 U.S. presidents. To the right of him is Henry C. Wallace, who was the son of Uncle Henry Wallace, the leading agricultural journalist of the day, and also the father of Henry A. Wallace, who would be an influential figure in the New Deal. And Henry C. Wallace was himself Secretary of Agriculture. To the left, though, is a guy named Lewis Herman Pamel, who was the most influential of Carver's mentors at Iowa State. Was a mycologist. He studied fungi and was also the first person to write a book in the English language with the term ecology in its title. But it was Iowa Agricultural College was a land-grant university. Today it's Iowa State University, and it was concerned with applied science, with applied agriculture. And so he was really trained as a technician. There were clear rules, clear methodologies, there were best practices. Next slide. So when he took the job at Tuskegee, Carver intended to introduce these best practices in Alabama, but he found himself, as you can see here, in a strange land and among a strange people. It was, as he said, a world of barren and fertile hillsides and wasted valleys where the denuded soils basically rewarded the Black tenants there with another mortgage as an unpleasant reminder of the year's hard labor. But Carver was supremely confident, in part because of his faith that he had been chosen to do this. Next slide. So he threw himself into a campaign to improve the situation for the Black tenants in Macon County. There are really 4 prongs to this, I argue. You can see them up on your screen. He taught at Tuskegee. We often think of Tuskegee as an industrial institute, but it was also a normal school. In fact, mostly what it did was train teachers. So he was teaching people to go out and teach his peculiar gospel of scientific agriculture. If we go clockwise, he also gave public lectures. There's an advertisement for a lecture that he was going to give at a farmer's picnic. Below that, he conducted experiments at the Tuskegee Experiment Station and published bulletins on them. And then he also pioneered extension work. And first, in fact, he designed the Jessup wagon, which is pictured there, which was the first federally funded extension project. So he would go out and talk to the farmers. So there are people mowing in the background. Hopefully that doesn't bother you. Can't distract you too much here. In any case, as he did this, as he launched his campaign, he found that he was increasingly aware that this technical kind of agriculture that he'd been taught didn't really serve the interest of the farmers he was trying to help. In fact, the best way to help them was to teach them to be more self-sufficient and less dependent on technologies and agricultural inputs. Next slide. And so gradually, the heart of his campaign shifted away from technological fixes. And I should say 2 of his first 3 bulletins, just for instance, were about chemically compounded fertilizers. But gradually he shifted away from that, realizing that Black tenants of Macon County understood their second-class citizenship largely as an environmental predicament, an agricultural predicament. He sought to teach them to rethink the world that they encountered every day. So you see the top 2 quotes here. We do not recognize and appreciate what nature has so lavishly provided. We are richer than we think we are. He was trying to get them to think differently, to see the world around them with new eyes. Because if they could do that, they could find some measure of respite, at least, from the harsh realities of Jim Crow, perhaps even economic dependence. So he would show them how to use things like tomato vines for dyes, how to dry wild plums that grew in the area. Swamp muck became fertilizer. All these waste products that were previously discarded became important parts of his plan. Even rare beauty and fragrance in the form of wild flowers and the like could be collected. And you'll see that he's not teaching a system. Begin at once to put some of them into effect, and others, I'm sure, will suggest themselves to you. He's trying to get farmers to think fundamentally differently. As he did, he drew connections between the eroded and exhausted soil and the poverty of the people. Say things like a poor soil produces only a poor people. But ultimately, the solution that he had was to get farmers to think not that the progressive farmer, the most up-to-date farmer, the most innovative farmer wasn't the one who used the newest technologies, but was instead the one who had learned to appreciate the mutual dependence of the animal, mineral, and vegetable kingdoms, and how utterly impossible it is for one to exist in a highly organized state without the others. The term ecosystem wasn't coined until the 1930s, but what he's talking about here is ecological agriculture. He's trying to get people to be soil builders and think ecologically in an era. And I would say that few of Carver's peers in progressive era conservation movement put ecology at the center of their thinking, or as frequently or as fundamentally as Carver did. Next slide. As he did so, he found himself out of step, though, with the central currents of agronomy at the time. So Alabama's Department of Agriculture was saying that the manufacture of scientifically prepared fertilizer is the best means of estimating the progress of a county at the time. Next one. But Carver, by contrast, by 1911 is saying, we know that commercial fertilizers aren't really the answer, right? He found himself, in other words, unafraid to look backwards for inspiration, though he realized that this had to be camouflaged somewhat, okay? In an era in which increased production was the end-all be-all, and in growing increasingly industrial and urban America, so he needed to keep food products and fiber products cheap for industry and for people. Next slide. This tension could be teased out in a longer talk. We could talk about how Carver's agricultural thought, after he became a rock star, following his 1921 appearance before the House Ways and Means Committee that turned him into the Peanut Man. In fact, this tension between modernizing and looking backwards really was at the heart of his agricultural thinking. He would later stop showing the peanut exhibit, calling it a technical exhibit of no value except to interest the curious and maybe a very few factory people. But he was also involved with the Chemergy movement, which sought to convert excess farm products like corn and soybeans into other things other than food, like paper and plastic and fuel. And so to convert that into profit for farmers. The movement was encouraged by Henry Ford, who's pictured with Carver here, who famously wanted a bushel of beans in every car. But production underlay these things. So we see Carver on one hand is part of this Chemergy movement. On the other hand, he's worried about the production emphasis that is required for it. J.I. Rodale, the founder of sort of organic farming in 1945, noted that for all its ingenious products, Chemergy threatened to extend a kind of monocrop agriculture that was certain to encourage soil exhaustion and erosion. And few Chemergists shared Carver's concerns, which he would have shared with J.I. Rodale. Next one. So in the end, Carver simply doesn't fit into conventional stories we've told about the origins of American environmental tradition or agricultural art. You see figures like Gifford Pinchot, and you see figures like Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir. They're the center of this story. Carver's in the wrong region. He's the wrong color. He's the wrong interest. He's interested in agriculture rather than wilderness or national parks. And he has the wrong political bent, which is to say he's not a very political person. More than that, his fame isn't for conservation. So there's all of this distracted him. And we get this two-dimensional caricature where he's famous for saving the South from bad agricultural practices, which didn't actually really happen. But he was actually truly innovative. He really did contribute to things like the Chemergy movement. He really did contribute to America's environmental tradition. So if we were to have a pantheon of American conservationists, I would think that Carver, because of his thinking, because of the way his formal training collided with the realities of the unpleasant realities of Alabama's agricultural systems, we have a truly innovative figure, one who's really worth celebrating today, who remains very much part of our usable past. I think I can stop there.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. And if we can please go on to Dr. Kremer.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill and Mark, for your comments. I'm going to build a bit on Mark's comments, but I'd like to begin by suggesting that George Washington Carver, really spent the bulk of his life in a search for self-sufficiency, and that it was this impulse towards self-sufficiency and his propensity to always want to make do with what he had and encourage others to do the same. I think that really began with his childhood, living on a self-sufficient, diversified farm that was a source of virtually all of its inhabitants' needs. The censuses from the 1860s and 1870s indicate that the Moses Carver farm in southwest Missouri's Newton County was a self-sufficient economic unit producing corn, wheat, oats, potatoes, flax, milk and beef cattle, swine, mules, horses, and oxen. There was an orchard, beehives that produced honey, the obligatory vegetable garden. From his earliest childhood, George Washington Carver learned that the needs he and his family had could be met by nurturing products from the soil. He learned as a child to draw upon nature's bounty. And even as an adult at Tuskegee Institute many years later, he often cooked greens over a Bunsen burner in his room when he didn't like what the cafeteria was serving. He knew that he could live off the land. He learned to be self-sufficient at an early age. As an adolescent, as Bill pointed out, he set out on his own to seek an education, knowing that he would have to take care of himself in a world of which he knew very little. While he was a student at the all-black Lincoln School in the Newton County town of Neosho, he earned his keep by doing chores for Andrew and Mariah Watkins, who took him into their home. And while living with the Watkinses, he learned to rely on plants and herbs to keep him healthy, taking to heart the plant-based folk remedies that were at the heart of Aunt Mariah's, quote, medical practice. During the late 1870s, while still a teenager, again, Bill pointed this out, Carver traveled to various Kansas communities, always paying his own way, taking care of himself by doing laundry, by cooking, by cleaning, or whatever he needed to do to survive. He even tried his hand at homesteading, which it seems to me is an extreme gesture of self-sufficiency or effort at self-sufficiency in Ness County, Kansas in the mid-1880s. He built himself a sod hut, and he tried to eke out a living on the recalcitrant western Kansas prairie. He did end up, as Mark says, at Iowa State College in Ames in the early 1890s, and he continued to pay his own way there by means of the same hardworking tasks he had long been accustomed to. He summed up his time at Iowa State in a letter. I'm quoting, "I did odd jobs of all kinds for a number of the professors, such as cutting wood, making gardens, working in the fields, helping clean house, taking care of the greenhouse and the chemical, botanical, and bacteriological laboratories," end quote. At Iowa State, again, as Mark pointed out, he found some of the most cutting-edge agricultural professors, finest professors available anywhere, finest facilities available in agriculture. And after 5 years at Iowa State, he completed both undergraduate and graduate degrees and became the only African-American in 1896 to possess a graduate degree in agriculture. And that is, of course, what attracted Booker T. Washington to him. And Washington, as Bill pointed out, invited Carver to come to Tuskegee Institute to direct an boarding agricultural education program. It's important to remember, and I think Mark made this point, that upon his arrival at Tuskegee in 1896, Carver was totally unprepared for what he found there. He had no experience in the South. Indeed, he had very little experience with other Black people. Up to that point, he really hadn't been south of the Mason-Dixon line. He was shocked by what he saw in Macon County, Alabama. Late in his life, he recalled that shock in a letter he wrote about his first trip to Alabama in October of 1896. I'm quoting, "When my train left the golden wheat fields and the tall green corn of Iowa for the acres of cotton, nothing but cotton, my heart sank a little. The scraggly cotton grew close up to the cabin doors, a few lonesome collards, the only sign of vegetables. Stunted cattle, bony mules, fields and hillsides cracked and scarred with gullies and deep ruts. Not much evidence of scientific farming anywhere. Everything looked hungry, the land, the cotton, the cattle, and the people," end quote. And as Mark pointed out, Carver wrote that he felt like a, quote, that he was in a, quote, strange land among a strange people, end quote. One of the first things that Carver did during his early tenure at Tuskegee was to undertake a series of experiments through which he tried to understand what plants would grow well in the Alabama soil and which ones would help to build up the soil and provide good forage. Understanding that Black Macon County farmers did not have money for expensive fertilizers and seeds, he attempted to focus on techniques that would cost little for farmers, or little more than their own hard labor and their own ingenuity. Less than 2 years after his arrival at Tuskegee, Carver published 2 of the scores of bulletins he would produce over the course of the next 4 decades, all of them aimed at improving the lives of Black farmers and helping them to become self-sufficient. Bulletin number 1, Feeding Acorns, introduced farmers to the notion that they could take the lowly and abundant acorn. Take the acorn, which was available without cost to them, wherever oak trees grew, and transform that acorn into an inexpensive source of livestock fuel or feed. This was a classic Carver innovation. Take something that was produced by nature and that was widely regarded as a valueless waste product and transform it into a valuable and useful commodity. Simultaneously, Carver produced a second bulletin in 1898, this one titled Experiments with Sweet Potatoes. This publication was informed, first of all, by Carver's acute awareness of how damaged the Alabama soil was by the poor land management practices of Alabama farmers, including the depletion of the soil's nutrients by the repeated growth of cotton and the failure to restore the soil's nutrients once they'd been drained from it. Carver had begun his experiments with sweet potatoes in 1897. He chose the sweet potato, he later wrote, because, quote, more bushels of sweet potatoes can be raised per acre than any other farm crop with less injury to the soil, unquote. One of his great innovations with regard to sweet potato production came in the way he prepared the soil. Deeply concerned about topsoil erosion and the lack of fertility of Alabama topsoil, after so many years of producing cotton and convinced that deep plowing of the soil would bring more nutrients to the surface, thereby reducing erosion and improving the quality of the plants in the soil, Carver resolved to use something almost unheard of in the Black Belt of Alabama, a 2-horse as opposed to a 1-horse plow. Years later, Carver remembered, quote, nobody had a 2-horse plow. I asked for one, and they thought I had lost every bit of gray matter I had, end quote. Meanwhile, Carver's experiments with and thoughts about how best to renew Southern soils continued to mature during his early tenure at Tuskegee. In 1905, he shared his conclusions with local farmers through an experiment station bulletin titled How to Build Up Worn Out Soils. He became an increasingly outspoken critic of the use of commercial fertilizers, in part because he knew that the farmers he sought to help could not afford them, but also because he realized that those fertilizers offered no long-term hope or help to the native soils. Instead, Carver urged the use of green fertilizers, organic materials that could be added to the soil. In a letter to Booker T. Washington, Carver describes some of the materials available on the Tuskegee campus, quote, decayed leaves, dead animals, decayed night soil, animal manures, end quote. In short, Carver wanted farmers to use products that they had at their disposal, in short, to be self-sufficient. Throughout his life, George Washington Carver believed that he could ward off diseases and treat those that could not be avoided by turning to the natural world. A proper diet was the first step in that process. In 1914, he wrote to Booker T. Washington, quote, there's probably no subject matter more important than the study of foods in relation to nutrition and health. I, he said, have not taken a pill, powder, salts, or oil for at least 30 years. And it has been quite 35 years since I was in bed sick. I regulate myself with vegetables, fruits, and wild herbs, nature's remedies which God intended we should use, end quote. Carver even turned to the use of plants to treat Tuskegee Institute and livestock, acting in his capacity as the school's erstwhile veterinarian in the absence of a formally trained animal doctor. In 1902, he wrote to Booker T. Washington's brother John, suggesting an herbal remedy for the school's dairy herd. Quote, I would also recommend that once a month, these animals be given a dose of condition powders made from various medicinal barks, roots, herbs, etc., which can be secured out of the woods and which forms the basis of condition powders, end quote. He emphasized, quote, this can be made here without any expense except the time and will be just as good as the condition powders we buy, in many respects better, because we will know the quantity and quality of the ingredients which enter into it, end quote. Eventually, Carver identified more than 100 plants growing in Macon County, which he believed had medicinal value. His call for self-sufficiency became sharper and more urgent with the onset of the Great Depression in the wake of the 1929 stock market crash. For a generation and more, Carver had been counseling all who would listen to be self-sufficient, to be frugal, to seek to diversify agricultural production and to avoid waste at all cost. In truth, by the onset of the Great Depression, although Carver had been working to improve the lives of Southern Blacks for more than 3 decades, and although he had published dozens of agricultural bulletins, taught hundreds, perhaps thousands of students, and talked to countless individuals, his well-intentioned efforts had resulted in little change in the lives of the vast majority of African Americans in the region. In 1934, in fact, Black sociologist Charles Johnson published a study that concluded that African American farm laborers in the county were more rather than less dependent upon white landowners for their wherewithal. Carver urged farmers to, quote, make up your mind now to not only live from products raised on your farm, but always have a surplus to sell, end quote. He urged farmers to, quote, keep 1 or 2 cows, proclaiming that a good, well cared for cow is half of any family's living. He called for them to raise chickens, proclaiming that, quote, a start of 12 good hens and 1 rooster will, with a little care, will furnish all the eggs needed in the family, some meat and a surplus at times to exchange for clothing and other necessities, end quote. He urged the growing and consumption of fruit and nuts and the substitution of nuts for meat in daily diets, as well as the raising of livestock, especially hogs, quote, no other animal converts into meat so much foodstuff that would otherwise go to waste. He called hogs mortgage lifters, asserting, quote, there is a great demand for hogs at all times. And he promised that, quote, they will pay any farmer out of debt if he will give them a chance. Meanwhile, as Mark pointed out, there was a correlative effort emerging in the country that aimed to reverse the fortunes of afflicted Americans. In 1935, in the depth of the Great Depression, a Harvard-trained chemist named William J. Billy Hale coined the term chemergy. He meant by this term the use of farm products to produce plastics, paints, and other products, including fuel sources that could serve as an alternative to gasoline. The emergence of the chemergy movement invigorated Carver and seemingly gave him a great deal of satisfaction, since it offered validation of much of what he had been teaching and preaching about since he had come to Tuskegee. In June 1936, he wrote, quote, now is the crucial time to chemicalize the farm. We must not only make the farm support itself, but others as well, with a large manufactured surplus to sell to those who are not fortunate enough to own and properly care for a farm, end quote. Carver called for the manufacture of many consumer items, including, quote, insulating boards, paints, dyes, industrial alcohol, plastics of various kinds, rugs, mats, and cloth from fiber plants, oils, gums, and waxes, and much more, all of which, quote, can be made from waste products of the farm. So I would conclude by saying George Washington Carver was a master of make do. He believed that nature provided everything that individuals needed to survive and thrive. Self-sufficiency through the effective use of nature's bounty was, or at least should be, the goal of each individual, especially those living on the farm. Thank you.
And thank you so much. Thank you all. Now I'm going to go straight to some questions. The first one is from Chris. With the idea of using waste products and changing the design of farming production, would it be fair to say that he was an early proponent of lean production systems in an agricultural sense before the term existed, to any and all?
Mark, that's your bailiwick.
Probably not. Carver, to integrate what Gary and what Bill talked about. Carver thought nature didn't produce any waste because every created thing, and the created thing was deliberate there for him, was part of an indispensable sort of an indispensable whole, that everything was an indispensable factor within that whole. So it's really like holistic, organic thinking rather than any kind of production theory. Carver was actually trying to extricate the farmers, as Gary suggested, from market systems to a large degree. In many ways, the farmers were facing the problems of any debtor, which is that credit gets you in trouble. And at the time, 60% interest rates were pretty normal. And you can imagine how difficult it is to get out of debt with 60% interest rates. And so with he's really looking for self-sufficiency rather than focusing on production. And so I'd be skeptical of saying he was thinking about any kind of production system at all, though there are certainly elements of it that aren't, that would fall into the lean system. In some ways, much like there were elements of what Carver was teaching that would fall into the Chemergy movement, that overlap with the Chemergy movement, but weren't of a piece with it.
Thank you. Anyone else on this, or? Okay. I'm going to ask, how much of what Carver was preaching was best existing practices amongst American farmers, you know, in Iowa, in Missouri, and how much of what he was preaching was stuff he was innovating completely?
I'll take a shot at that. Carver was trained in the world of scientific agriculture, but so he certainly knew he knew about crop rotation, he knew about fertilizers, he knew about plant disease. But I think Mark may or may not agree with me, but I think he just almost had to start from the beginning when he went to Alabama. I think it was such a shock and such a new experience. I don't think he was thinking about cutting edge practices. I think he was thinking about how to help these people survive. You know, I mean, one of the things we didn't talk about is he was very concerned about the Southern diet. Pellagra was absolutely devastating the working farmers, black and white, of Alabama. He was concerned about improving the diet, of getting poor Southern farmers, black and white, more protein, for example. So I don't think he was trying to take best practices from Iowa to Alabama. I think he was at a much more basic subsistence level kind of strategy.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I could add a little bit to this. So you have to keep in mind the broader context of the time, which is that we think of farmers, and there's this split vision of farmers. We have this Jeffersonian farmer, which is the heart of the American Republic, the ideal American. By the time Carver goes to Tuskegee, that is collapsing. The ideal American is now a professionally trained businessman or a professional of some sort. By 1914, the federal government, with the Smith-Lever Act, creates an extension service, which is nothing if not a suggestion that farmers there's such a problem that they need federal assistance, right? And so scientific agriculture, through the extension service in Carver's lifetime, which is beginning, is seeking to correct the things that Carver's doing. So Carver finds himself increasingly out of step with the main currents of American agronomy with each progressing year, basically, which is why he says things like, we need to look back to the past for inspiration. We can't just throw all that out and look at 2-horse plows, chemically compounded fertilizers, all of that sort of thing. We need to say, look, there were some things that worked well for farmers. And if production is the end, right, we can produce a lot of food. But if production is the end, in terms of cotton or whatever, then the farmers aren't really the end. And we need to be thinking about the people. It was profoundly human. It was profoundly humane in that regard. He's mostly interested in the well-being of the people rather than the production of foodstuff or fiber, which is the main interest of the USDA by this point. I mean, James Wilson writes him and says, we can't do these things that you're suggesting in many ways because food is so expensive in cities. So we got to keep it, we got to find a way to keep food cheaper. It's largely worked. I mean, I should say, in 1945, Americans paid roughly a third of their income, family income, to food. Today is less than 10%. But rural America has sort of collapsed in the meantime. It's not quite that simple, but there are plenty of boarded up buildings. And
just to add one thought to what Mark said, there's a great letter in the 1930s during the middle of the Depression when Carver takes out after what he calls Americans' money madness, and he, again, he's not trying to encourage a way to make money or to produce agricultural products for the commercial market. He's trying to teach people how to survive and how to live well in the South, how to live better lives simply with what they have. But he's not, in that regard, he's almost not a capitalist. He's very upset, again, in the 30s with what he calls the money madness of Americans.
Thank you.
There's one quote where Carver writes to a Robert Johnson of the Chelsea Enterprises of Ontario, March 24th of 1925. And he says that he would not allow anyone to give him money, no difference how badly he needed it. He wanted literally to earn his own living. And so he had, that you mentioned, that self-sufficiency, but that sort of underlied a lot of his influence.
Thank you. I'm going to actually have a question on, well, religion. Where is he in the range of American religion between, the 1890s and the 1930s? That, there is a great variety of American religion, and how does he appear in that landscape? And I guess I'm going to say, in particular, how does his religion help him to establish community with Southern Black farmers, or is he sufficiently different in his form of religion from Southern Baptist worship that there's any difficulty because of that?
Well, matter of fact, I just put together a book on Booker T. Washington, and he talked about that religion was different from denominationalism. And so he talked about loving God, but don't get caught up in denominationalism. Carver would say things, thank God I love humanity. Complexion doesn't interest me one single bit. And I am not rich in this world's goods, but thank God, like yourself, I have enough to live comfortably. I have the assurance that God will take care of me. He blesses me with the ability to earn a living. So it was not denominationally attached, but it was more of a general Christian view. One of the quotes that he writes to Jack Boyd, who was a YMCA official in Denver, March 1st of 1927. And I actually, after publishing my book, a descendant of Jack Boyd contacted me with all kinds of personal paraphernalia and pictures of them. But so this is a quote: "My beloved friend, keep your hand in that of the master, walk daily by his side, so that this may lead you and others into the realms of true happiness, where a religion of hate, which poisons the body and soul, will be unknown, and having in its place the golden rule way, which is the Jesus way of life, which will reign supreme. Then we can walk and talk with Jesus momentarily, because we'll be attuned to his wishes." Another quote he gave of having, as a child, would go into the woods and observe the plants. He said he didn't have any pets, but the plants were his pets. And he said one time he went into the woods and saw it so orderly, and he had the impression that someone had not been there, but someone was there. And he said from that moment on that the scripture of the Apostle Paul became real, that in him we live and move and have our being, and the great out of doors was like a chapel that the Creator could be spoken to and heard from. So a little bit of a spiritual aspect to him that was maybe a little unconventional, but definitely real. And I love the one quote where he, this was to the YMCA, which had sponsored him to speak at a number of events. And this was a speech at the Blue Ridge YMCA. Dr. Willis Weatherford introduces him, and he says he always looks forward to introductions to learn more about himself, sort of. But he goes, years ago, I went into my laboratory and said, "Dear Mr. Creator, can you tell me what the universe was made for?" The Creator answered, "You want to know too much for that little mind of yours. Ask something more your size, little man." Then I asked, "Please, Mr. Creator, tell me what man was made for." Again, the great Creator replied, "You're asking too much. Cut down on the extent, improve on the intent." "Please, Mr. Creator, will you tell me what the peanut was made for?" "That's better, but even that's infinite. What do you want to know about the peanut?" "Mr. Creator, can I make milk out of the peanut?" "What kind of milk you want to make? Good Jersey milk or just plain boarding house milk?" "Good Jersey milk." And then the great Creator taught me to take the peanut apart and put it together again. And out of the process has come forth all these products.
Thank you. I actually want to follow
May I
up.
just
Oh, sorry.
make a comment? It is important to remember, though, that for years Carver taught a Bible study class on the Tuskegee campus every Sunday night. And I many years ago I interviewed a gentleman who ran away from home at the age of 15 in 1915 and came to Tuskegee, and he got into that Bible study class. And he was in his late 80s when I interviewed him, 70 years later. And it still was a transformational experience for him to recount sitting at the feet of George Washington Carver, and as he put it, having Carver explain the parables to me. So I mean, there was some conventionality. He certainly did pay great heed to the Bible, and he did. Certainly, the Tuskegee students who attended his Bible study classes were enthralled with him and were certainly not offended by any interpretations he offered them.
Yeah, and then
Go ahead.
Tuskegee itself was started in the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, by Booker T. And then Booker T. talked about how there was YMCA. His students were involved in that. And they had mission societies and preaching and prayer meetings and prayer services. And he says, we do not neglect the spiritual side at Tuskegee, even though we're agricultural emphasis. So I agree completely there that he was a firm adherent of the Bible. And you can, when you read through his writings, he's constantly quoting scriptures. So it's not, it's almost second nature that he will throw a scripture in a letter. I actually spoke at George Washington Carver Elementary School in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they actually had a letter on the wall from Carver to the school. And it said that I wish my students would that read his word, because it's a lamp unto your feet and a light into your path. So he's quoting a scripture verse in the letter to the school written in, I think it was 1935. But
Thank you. I actually want to twist this a little bit and go to Professor Hersey. Is there a particular tradition of Christian ecology into which he fits? And if so, who are the other figures with whom he should be compared, and on whom who either influenced him or whom he did influence?
There is a tradition of Christian ecology. It's a religious studies question, probably more than a historical one for me. I would point you, in terms of background on this, probably to Mark Stoll's Inherit the Holy Mountain. If you're looking to read more about this, what you'll see is that many of the leading key figures in the American environmental tradition. Grew up in religious homes. John Muir, for instance. Many of them are lapsed Christians. And they tend to be, Stoll argues, from particular denominations, generally from Calvinist denominations, Congregationalists in New England, especially Presbyterians later. That's a little bit more complicated argument. Carver, of course, ecology didn't exist really as a real science, it existed, but it was viewed as part of a sub-discipline of botany, basically, during when Carver first shows up, really for most of Carver's life. Is not associated with conservation really until the very end of Carver's life. So it's just like he wasn't really influenced by it in that particular way. But there are obviously antecedents that he could have been drawing on. I think what influenced Carver most in some ways was the social gospel. He was less, which was very much a part of the era he was in, particularly pronounced in Kansas when he was there. If you think about In His Steps, written by Wichita minister, for instance, right before Carver moved to Tuskegee. Carver wasn't very interested in theology. Maybe Gary or Bill could tell me otherwise, but I don't remember the term propitiation, for instance, or substitutionary atonement appearing in Carver's writings. But you do have lots of references to the Bible and a profound appreciation of what you might call natural theology. He did marvel at sunsets, cotton fields on the bowl, but he also marveled at God's glory as revealed in microscopic, looking through his microscope at fungi. Nothing reveals God's glory like this, which is pretty rare, even among Christians at the time, and seeing that sort of the richness, the depth of the creation.
One interesting letter he wrote to James Hardwick in 1928, and he talks about his attitude toward life is also the attitude toward science. Jesus said one must be born again. He must become as a little child. He must let no laziness, no fear, no stubbornness keep him from duty. If we were born again, he would see life from a plane in which he would have the energy not to be impeded in this duty by the various sidetrackers or inhibitors. My work, my life must be in the spirit of a little child seeking only to know the truth and follow it. My purpose alone must be God's purpose, to increase the welfare and happiness of his people. Nature will not permit a vacuum. It will be filled with something. Human need is really a great spiritual vacuum which God seeks to fill. With one hand in the hand of a fellow man in need and the other in the hand of Christ, he could get across the vacuum and I became an agent. Then the passage, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, came to have real meaning. As I worked on projects which fulfilled the real human need, forces were working through me that amazed me. I would often go to sleep at night with an apparently insoluble problem. When I woke, the answer was there. Why then should we who believe in Christ be so surprised at what God can do with a willing man in a laboratory? Some things must be baffling to the critic who has never been born again. Then he goes on to say, by nature, I am a conserver. I found the nature to be conserver. But clearly the references there are wanting to help people and have let God use him to help people in a very practical way.
Thank you. Now I'm going to switch topics suddenly to go to Larry's question. By the way, more questions encouraged. How much influence did Carver's work have in the poor white communities in Alabama? And how did that information travel? That is, how did he connect with that audience? To any and all.
I had one experience. I spoke in Birmingham years ago, and a lady whose father was a judge in the area, and she said he had gone to, may have been the University of Georgia, but he wrote a paper on the poor treatment of the Black sharecroppers, and he was denied his degree, and Carver wrote a letter interceding for him to get accepted into Harvard. And he got accepted into Harvard, got his law degree, came back and be a judge. And this lady, when her father died, gave like a $10,000 grant to Tuskegee. And the president of Tuskegee in the newspaper article said, this is not unusual for George Washington Carver. Here, he even wrote a letter to get a white guy, a white person accepted into Harvard. But that one quote, he says, thank God I love humanity. Complexion doesn't interest me one single bit. So he sort of wanted to help everyone.
I'm not sure I can address that question about poor whites in the South, although he did have white friends around Tuskegee. But as you were asking the question, I thought about, and as Bill responded, I thought about his relationship with the young men he called my boys, the young white teenagers in the wake of the 1921 testimony before the House Ways and Means Committee, when he became a kind of a cult figure, and the Congress on Interracial Cooperation and the YMCA engaged him to make talks throughout the South at YMCA camps. He invariably came into contact with young late teenage white males, many of whom became absolutely smitten and enthralled with him and came to visit him at all white or all black Tuskegee. And imagine what that must have been like in the 1920s, the descendants of slave owners visiting a former slave, and the descendants of slaves at Tuskegee Institute, sometimes spending days on the campus. And Carver engaged in these lifelong, intense correspondences with these young white men who were profoundly moved by him. In the late 1980s, I tracked a few of these then elderly white men down and talked with them about their experiences with Carver. And by this time, Carver's been dead almost half a century. And these men would speak about Carver with tears rolling down their eyes and about the transformational event it was to meet with and talk with him. So he had a lot of interaction with white folks. And he always, I think virtually anybody who ever had an encounter with Carver was profoundly moved by that experience.
And Professor Hersey, do you have anything to add to this, or?
Well, if you were to talk about his influence, I mean, it's hard to judge his influence again in the Black community, really, truth be told, at least early on. When he shows up, Macon County is about 95% of the farmers are tenant farmers. By the time of World War I, when his campaign to improve their lives sort of comes to a close, and his position become a famous person, the Peanut Man, it's about 86% are tenant farmers. So there's been some real improvement, but Booker T. Washington's done a good bit of this. He's bought land sort of surreptitiously and sold it. The Institute is trusted, and he's sold it surreptitiously to Black farmers. So it's hard to say how much influence Carver really had. If his aim was to lift Black farmers from poverty in Macon County, Alabama, and throughout the South, he largely failed in that sense. His campaign foundered on the political and social realities of the Jim Crow South, right? That doesn't mean it's not valuable. In fact, I argue just the opposite. It's very valuable. The influence among white people would be different given the racial mores of the day. Carver was well known. He was well respected, as Booker T. Washington was. He had the imprimatur of Tuskegee on him. He was a riveting public speaker, so people would come and see him if you wanted the avenues through which he might transmit his message to poor white farmers, state fairs, picnics, that sort of thing. He would come and he would illustrate his lectures and talk, all conversational. The same thing that when moved him at the House Ways and Means Committee from 10 minutes to unlimited time. He was just enchanting. People were drawn to him. And so, so far as the influence goes, it would go through those channels. How influential he was, I mean, his colleagues at Tuskegee didn't like him especially well. They especially were skeptical of his alternative agriculture. Right, he would go out and collect weeds, dandelion leaves and stuff to eat, collect flowers to put in his pail. It all seemed really eccentric to them. And they have recorded an interview in a newspaper, I guess the Montgomery Advertiser carried this one, where after listening to a Carver lecture, they have an interview with a guy who said they'll have us eating acorns before too long. So I wouldn't say it's uniformly welcomed, but it's heard. And he is also published his essays published in newspapers, and so there are ways his message does get out there. I don't know how you would track its influence among white farmers, in particular in terms of on the ground action. But he winds up being adored. He's one of these really unusual people who was adored by everybody in his lifetime.
I could add to that, and the James Hardwick, and he was from Virginia Polytechnic Institute. His brother Harry Hardwick was the head football coach for the U.S. Naval Academy, but he was one of the boys that Gary mentioned. So in 1923, George Washington Carver writes, "In my work, I meet many young people who are seeking truth. God has given me some knowledge. When they let me, I try to pass it on to my boys." And he uses that term, my boys. And another place he said, "I have had 8 letters from the boys already. I've heard from everyone in the cottage where I stayed. 2 of them are coming down soon, they say. 2 have sent their pictures and others are coming, you and those other boys." He says, "I love you because I love Christ in you." And it goes on like that. But
Thank you. I'm going to shift actually to a slightly different question then. Are there comparable figures in other countries? And I guess in terms of the agricultural practice that he's saying, don't go over the super high tech stuff, use what's available ecologically within the limits of poor farmers. And it strikes me as something you could hear in Europe, Asia, Africa. So are there in fact equivalent figures out there whom we should compare him to?
Well, he did get letters from all around the world inviting him to end Booker T. And he even got letters from Russia and helping get help with their agriculture. And but he said that he wouldn't go, but his students, he was called to the South, and others would go. But he did with correspondence. There's pictures of him at his desk with like a 1.5 foot high pile of letters from all around the world that he was corresponding with. But in particular, I remember India and Russia requesting help with agriculture. And
Sure, there are figures. And of course, Tuskegee is sending people out there too. So sort of famously, and Andrew Zimmerman has written a book about this called Alabama in Africa. But Tuskegee sends agricultural missionaries, such as they are, to Togo, to the German authorities basically, in some ways, want a pliant labor force, like they envision Alabama has, to grow cotton. And of course, it doesn't go at all like anyone thinks it will go, but they're out there. I think, and I end in my book this, I think in some ways Carver was anticipating things like Ernst Schumacher's "Small is Beautiful," economics as if people mattered in the 1970s, which is in part a response, I think, to the Green Revolution around the world. And so I would argue, in fact, I did argue, that Carver's environmental vision, if it didn't attract as much attention at the time, if it's sort of neglected, might be more applicable than someone like John Muir's appreciation for wilderness, in that in a rapidly developing world where rural economies are being drawn into market agriculture, he offers a model for how you might possibly support development in a way that is friendly to the people, is sustainable, in places where there are vast disparities in wealth and power, basically. And so, yeah, he is. There are people who are out there. You get more of them by the 1970s from around the world who are concerned about the people, not the economy, not the economics. And there's a whole large literature on this now, particularly in the history of science and indigenous knowledge and that sort of thing. So yeah, he's not alone, but he's almost alone in America at the time, in the 1900s, teens, 20s. And
thank you. A question then about his reputation. What is the effect of there no longer being a vast majority of Blacks being in Southern Black farmers? You know, that is, he starts out as an iconic figure when the vast majority of Blacks in America are living on farms in the South. This is no longer true by what, 1970? You know, give the year, but you know, the vast migration both out of the South and to the cities. How does that affect his reputation and his iconic status? How do, in fact, when people were talking about a usable past, how is that affecting his being a person who provides a usable past for African Americans, for Americans in general?
Before even addressing that question, Carver was very disturbed by what historians call the Great Migration, the movement of African Americans from the South and from rural areas to cities in the period beginning with World War I and then moving into and through the Depression and World War II. And in fact, during the Depression, the Great Depression, he actually saw that as an opportunity to try to persuade Blacks to move back to the rural South, because jobs were becoming scarce during the Depression in cities. But I think he was an agrarian. He was never comfortable with cities, and he was not comfortable with Blacks becoming an urban people. So to answer your question, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't. I'm not sure. Everybody seems to know the name George Washington Carver, but very few people really have a substantive or in-depth knowledge of what Carver was all about. It's a conundrum, and I think that's true for Black Americans and white Americans, all Americans.
Yeah, I think some of the attitudes of Booker T. Washington were similar. And of course, Booker T. gave his famous address at the Atlanta Exposition. And it was cast, so he's speaking to a Black audience and a white audience, and it's all in front of the public eye. And he talks about in South America, there was a ship off the coast, and they put up a flag saying, we need water, and the other ship sends a message back, cast down your buckets where they are. And then the message comes again, we need water, and then it comes back, cast down your buckets where you are. It happens a third time, and then they put the buckets down, and they found out that it's water from the Amazon River that goes, it's fresh water that goes out with such force, you could be like 100 miles off coast and put down the bucket and get fresh water. And so Booker T. says, I'm speaking to my Black brothers in the South and the white, and he says, put down your buckets where you are. Work together. And to the white, you've known us as I'm paraphrasing, but you know us as Blacks who have worked with you. You can trust us, and then vice versa. And but the attitude was probably similar to. Matter of fact, in the letter that Carver writes to Booker T. accepting to go to Tuskegee, he says, I've read of your address, and I agree with you that that's the answer to the race problem. And
right, and Professor Hersey, or you're muted, or you were muted.
Yeah, so I don't know that the change of African-American farmers, the decline in them, which is precipitous between 1940 and 1974, 93% of Black farmers lose their land. Lots of farmers of all races lost their land in those years as get bigger, get better, or get out became sort of the prevailing rule of American agriculture. But as is so often the case, it affected Black farmers disproportionately. I think what really had to do with Carver's reputation, the transformation of that, was the civil rights movement. I think in the 1930s and 40s, 20s for that matter, white and Black Americans alike have reason to grab onto Carver. For Black Americans, Carver is proof of what's possible with opportunity. Like, how many more George Washington Carvers could be out there? For Jim Crow advocates in the South, Carver is proof of what's possible within the Jim Crow system. If Carver could do it, anybody like Carver could do it. In the wake of the civil rights movement, there just isn't the need for a contributionist hero, proof that Black Americans are capable of the same things white Americans are capable of. That's just no longer needed. And so what did Carver do? And they began looking at this, historians in the 1970s, like, well, actually, he didn't really save the economy of the South. He didn't really invent the things he's credited with inventing. He has, Gary, was it 2 or 3 patents in his name?
Yeah.
None of them were very commercially successful. Why is this guy the most famous Black man in America? Right? How did this happen? And it must be that he sold himself out. He allowed himself to be taken advantage of. And that gets rectified, as I indicated, by McMurray's biography, I think. But in terms of his reputation, I really think it's the triumph of the civil rights movement, which by the 1970s is becoming more radical in the sense that the demands are becoming greater and harder for, I would say, white Americans to see, right? And so if you're looking at the shift in Carver's reputation, you see that. So where are contributionist heroes? Where are contributionist heroes still taught? In elementary schools, right? So the editor of the book series that I published my book in has never encountered Carver in any college level course, but both of his sons had to do dioramas of Carver in their elementary school, right? Thing. So this is how we get these 2 different visions, where we get, as Gary said, Carver who's famous, but people don't know why, something vaguely related to peanuts, probably. And then we have Carver who we don't know what to do with him as scholars. What did he really do? So I think that's what, if you were trying to pin down what happened with his reputation, is less to do with the decline of Black agriculture and more to do with larger political developments in America.
Okay. I could actually then have one follow-up question, I think, before we get to the conclusion. What did his colleagues at Tuskegee Agriculture do that we should know about? Everybody else who was hired in the agriculture department, what are their contributions?
Well, you're talking about agriculture or Tuskegee generally?
Agriculture.
Because, I mean, Carver was agriculture at Tuskegee for many years. I'm not sure. Mark, you got any sense of that?
I think you're muted still.
It's not a Zoom call until someone says you're still muted. All right. There were the first Black extension agent in the U.S. was working out of Tuskegee, operating one of Carver's students, actually operating the Jessup wagon, and there's still people still doing really important work at Tuskegee today. Actually, occupying Carver's chair. Tuskegee's been involved in developing ways to feed astronauts in these micro systems. So they're doing really, they still are doing really important work at Tuskegee, which is remarkable considering how even today underfunded it is, I think, as an HBCU. So mostly what they're doing, and you can track this change over Carver's career. Early on, when Carver's really involved in the extension efforts, it's pushing his gospel of self-sufficient kind of agriculture that runs in the face of the main currents. In fact, George Bridgeforth, who's sort of his nemesis in the agricultural department there, complains to Carver that there's not more technical stuff on the Jessup wagon, and Carver's like, well, if you can make it yourself, you can take it out there. But after the Smith-Lever Act, and then we get the in 1917, there's a separate act. But by 1917, Tuskegee's extension agents are answering to the folks at Auburn, and it looks more and more like conventional USDA sponsored agriculture, much to Carver's chagrin when he comes back to the situation in the 1930s, when the world has changed. Self-sufficiency is still important, but you can't produce a Ford, Model T or Model A or whatever it is on your farm. And if this is viewed as an essential, sort of out of luck.
I would add too that Carver kept up a remarkable correspondence with his farmer students. I am struck by how much time he must have spent just writing letters. And his students went all over the country. And as Mark said earlier, in many cases, they established what they referred to as little Tuskegees. Here in Missouri, there was a school called the Dalton Vocational School that was established by one of Carver's students that covered a 9-county area and was in existence and prospered until integration came in the 1950s. But his students are always writing back to him about efforts they're making at promoting agriculture in the communities they end up in, and they're all over the South. Indeed, they're all over the country, or certainly the Midwest and the South.
Thank you. I would actually, at this point, since we're getting close to our 3:30 out, I would ask, may I ask, would each of you be willing to give a 1-minute closing? I think again in alphabetical order, and then I'll do a sort of a last little bit on closing for the NES. Mr. Federer, may I ask if you would go first?
Yeah, well, I did want to at least mention some of the other people that Booker T had brought to Tuskegee, and one is Robert Robinson Taylor, and he's the first accredited African-American architect who graduated from MIT. And so he helped build the buildings there on the Tuskegee campus. And so there was a number of other individuals that were quite prominent that didn't get the notoriety of Carver, but it was quite an impressive assemblage of individuals that were there at Tuskegee. William Howard Taft was someone that was impressed that Booker T started a National Negro Business League before the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And William McKinley went down to Tuskegee, and Teddy Roosevelt. So the university itself was of national prominence. And then George Washington Carver together with that. So there's a 50-cent piece coin with Carver and Booker T's image on it. Carver has postage stamp with his image. And he, I think, embodied the message, and this is why he's so much of a figure in schools, is somebody that can start from absolutely nothing and less than nothing, having been born a slave, and achieve international reputation. He was humble. They said when he died, they opened the drawer of his desk and there were uncashed paychecks and then all the money he had saved, he gave back to Tuskegee, and just very selfless. He really took an interest in the students. He loved humanity. He loved nature. But I mentioned that one quote, with one hand in the hand of a fellow man in need and the other in the hand of Christ, he could get across the vacuum. and I became an agent. So basically he wanted to be used by the Lord to help people, and particularly the people in the South. And that example of someone who wants to help people, who started from nothing, got internationally known, is inspirational. And he was not involved politically. He was able to be above that, and is somebody that I think, because of his humility, everybody can find something with his life that they can identify with and be encouraged by.
Thank you so much. Professor Hersey.
Yeah, so I set out with my dissertation years ago to figure out what Carver meant when he said he was a conservationist. And I think that really is his profound legacy in many ways. I mean, we could take all sorts of lessons if we wanted to, that without concern for issues of, for that conservation initiatives that don't take into account gross disparities in wealth and power and social inequality aren't going to prove successful ultimately. But I think it's as important to remember that the conservation movement was never lily white, right? That W.E.B. Du Bois, who was also offered a job at Tuskegee in 1896, would have been a slightly different history if he'd accepted that position, I think, waxed eloquent about the beauty of Bar Harbor. And I think it's important to situate America's environmental thought, which is one of its big exports, right? National parks is America's greatest idea, for instance. Ken Burns is to be believed. In a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial context, that it is an American thing, not a white American thing, not a rich white American thing, and that we can work to make it that way. So, I would argue that we need to think about Carver, that he is very much part of our useful past, but not as a contributionist figure anymore. As someone who really thought deeply about the natural world and did so in a way that wasn't inherently political and that wasn't that didn't exclude religious folks, right? That was profoundly humane and deeply scientific.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kremer.
I would simply urge our viewers, to discover Carver. Mark made the point earlier that Carver was not well thought of, as was Booker T, in the 60s and 70s during the early civil rights movement and the early Black history movement. I was one of those students who, in the 1960s, really had very little use for either Booker T or George Washington Carver, because I thought of them as Uncle Toms. I was a young history professor 40-some years ago who was asked to catalog a collection of Carver's letters at the Carver National Monument in Diamond, Missouri. And I took it on as an alternative to teaching summer school. I did not take this on because I was fascinated with Carver, but I got smitten with Carver. I became fascinated with the man, reading the scores of letters that he wrote and that he received. And I think Carver has lessons for all of us. And so I would simply conclude by saying there are some good works out there. Mark's book, Bill's book, my books, Linda McMurray's books. There's plenty of information out there to discover the real Carver. And I would urge our viewers to try to find that real Carver and not the Carver myth.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Now, I'm just going to close with a few words. First, the thank yous. Thank you to our participants. It's wonderful listening to you. It's wonderful learning from you. Thank you to our audience. We do this for you. and we can't do it without you. Your questions, above all, make this possible and make it fun. I will mention merely by way of advertisement, if you enjoyed a webinar like this, you might consider joining the National Association of Scholars. We do many things, but among other things, lots of webinar series like American Innovation. So keep that in mind. I want to remind people again, if you have more questions, please send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'll be delighted to forward your questions to our participants so they can have the option to answer you. If you want to listen to this again or tell other people about this, go to our YouTube channel, National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Within 24 hours, this should be up and the link available for everyone. If you want to watch more stuff like this, we are continuing our American Innovations webinar series, and I believe the next one's actually on the Green Revolution in 2 weeks. So from George Washington Carver to Norman Borlaug, we'll give everybody a whiplash, I think, but it'll be a good whiplash for 2 wonderfully, quintessentially American figures. I think that's probably all of the business. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you all. It's been a delight, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.